Our first speaker is Charlie Cheever. He's the CEO of Expo, and before that, he co-founded a question-answer website called Quora. Before that, he worked at Facebook, where he did a bunch of things like come up with the news feed, which everybody really loves, I guess. So yeah, let's welcome Charlie Cheever up on stage.
Thanks, Brent, for that intro. That was a joke. I did not come up with the idea for newsfeed. It's amazing to be here. This is so cool to see this whole room full of people. And I want to echo the thanks that Brent gave for especially Magda and Roman and everyone at Software Mansion for putting this on and being such great hosts. And thanks to all of you for coming. I thought the best thing for me to do here would be to give sort of a state of the union on Expo, like give a little bit of the history of why it exists and where it's come from, and then like what we're working on right now and what we've done in the last year, where we are, and then some things we're going to be working on in the future to give a sense of the direction. So I'll jump right into that. So I'll give you a brief history of Expo. About 10 years ago, I was working at Quora, and we were trying to make the first version of the website, and we built it as quickly as we could in Python. And we were just trying to build an MVP as quickly as possible. And this was 10 years ago, so there wasn't, like the main thing that people were using to build websites was sort of jQuery and maybe Rails. But we built it in Python, and once we built this first version that wasn't quite right, iterating on it was really, really hard. And so after a few days of frustration, I'm just trying to add features and these kind of things, we basically ended up saying, hey, like we have a bunch of experience making websites, we have a bunch of ideas about how to do it better, let's pause and build better tooling and abstractions to make our lives easier and go forward. So we took 6 weeks and we made a web framework called WebNode and LiveNode. It had a lot of the same ideas as React, but maybe not quite as elegant. And we used that to build the first version of the website with only like 4 people. And it turned out really well in a lot of ways. And we could iterate on it much more quickly and add new features much more quickly. And they were more consistent and better. And that was one of the best decisions that we made. And so that was something that was sort of a lesson learned, where if you have ideas about how something can be better, when you want to build something, it's sometimes worth it to take a break and go do that. So then a few years later, Quora was sort of getting popularity as a website, and I was on my phone all the time, checking Twitter or texting or whatever, and just more and more I was on my phone, and so was everyone else. And so we decided that we should probably have an iPhone app. And so we just decided we had a decent mobile website, and what we would do is just wrap that in a native scaffolding tab bar. So we took a designer and an engineer who had done really good work before, and we said, okay, just wrap a tab bar around this mobile website, and we'll call it a day. And then, 9 months later, we'd finally done that. And that was a while ago, so things are a little bit better now, but a lot of the things are just hard. Even just the final step of submitting to the App Store. So even though that was felt like an insanely long process to me for doing something that felt really, really simple intuitively, it came out pretty well. And a bunch of people started to use the app, and it became 10% right away of our usage, then 11%, then 12%. And so pretty quickly we were like, we need to do an Android app too. And I thought, okay, well, we've already modified our mobile web view to interact with a native scaffolding. We already have a design for the app. We've already figured out a lot of the product choices, et cetera. This should be pretty easy. And then Android is fragmented and more complicated, so it took 10 months to get an Android app done. And so that was something that just really struck me as like, wow, that was just out of whack. It felt like time traveling back into the 90s in terms of the way we were developing software compared to doing web development. So after I left Quora, I had a bunch of ideas about what I could do next. But I had so many ideas, I didn't know which one to pursue. Almost all of them, though, were basically involved some kind of mobile interface. Just more and more people were getting cell phones, and it became sort of clear that there were going to be 8 billion people in the world with mobile devices, and maybe like 2 billion people using computers. So this is a notepad with some scribbles of one idea that I had. The idea was that since I had just left my job and I wasn't working, I had a lot of free time, and I kind of felt useless 9 to 5. And people would email me a lot and say, hey, can we grab coffee? You want to grab a beer with me? and we would have to coordinate and meet up, and that there was just all this overhead where you have to drive to the bar or drive to the coffee shop, park, somebody's late, and then you talk for 25 minutes or 45 minutes, and then you drive, 45 minutes home, and it just felt like a whole day gets wasted meeting up with someone. And if it was really a big deal, then that could be cool, but it just felt like it should be lighter weight somehow. So the idea that I had was maybe what I could do is just drive around, and if somebody needed a ride to the airport or needed a ride to work, if I was in the area, they could have this app like Uber, except that I would be the only driver on it, and only my friends are allowed to use it, and they could just request rides from me. So then I could meet up with them, and we could chat and catch up, and I could feel useful, and they could get like a free ride. So I think this is sort of a silly app idea, but I think it's one of these things that is sort of either genius or totally stupid. And the problem with it is the only way to figure out the answer to that question is to build it. And if it was a website, I think I could have built it in like a weekend. Probably would have taken like a week because things always take longer than you think they do. But that's still really reasonable to try out and do. But when I thought about making it as an app, it was just like, oh my gosh, do I want to spend 9 months building a V1 of this thing that will be really hard to change if I don't hit the mark exactly, and it will only work on half my friends' phones? Not really. And so then instead of doing that or any of the other 6 ideas that I had, I ended up thinking like somebody's just got to solve this problem. So somebody has to solve that problem too. So I grabbed my friend James, and we started researching this. We looked at HTML5 a lot, and we basically decided that HTML5 was not good enough for building the kinds of experiences that you want, where you have gestures and animations that need to feel really good because you're actually touching the device. And so we started playing around with building native UI widgets controlled by JavaScript, and we implemented all of Node's API on iOS and had this whole thing. And then React Native came out as an open source project and had 20 people working on it instead of 2 people working on it. So we basically said, hey, let's take React Native and build everything else that needs to happen to make this really good for building apps like this really, really quickly. And then we found this guy named Brent was contributing a lot to React Native in the open source repo, and we asked him to help out with it. And then many more people along the way have helped along with the project. And so we got there today. So the reason I bring this up and tell this story a lot is to kind of tell you what the North Star is for the Expo project. It's not about making React Native easy for beginners. It's not about something like that. It's about like closing that distance between what you imagine you want an application to exist and then getting that in your hands. It's about like reducing the accidental complexity of building application software and whittling it down to just the essential complexity. And it's about just like serving developers and solving problems for them and meeting their needs. And so that's kind of just like making it so that when I imagine something or you imagine something, that as quickly as possible and as easily as possible, we can have that thing in our hands and in our users' hands. That's the mission and what we're trying to do here. So, what have we built? What is Expo? It's a bunch of different things. It's client apps. We have an app in the iOS App Store and the Google Play Store, and you can use these apps to develop without having to, build an app with Xcode or Studio yourself. And it's a CLI and a desktop GUI that let you write code on your computer and then serve it up so it can be loaded by these apps and publish and do these other things. We have Snack, which is this tool that you can code just on the web, and so you can get started in just a few seconds. A lot of classes that teach programming, especially with React Native or with Expo, use Snack. And we also have the Expo SDK, which is probably the meatiest part of all this, which is this big standard library that handles push notifications, camera access, Google login, Facebook login, et cetera, everything you need to do so that you can write just JavaScript and all the native code is handled for you in most cases. And we also have cloud services that will build an app for you so that if you don't have a Mac, you can build an iPhone app, for example. And we'll give you an IPA or an APK or whatever. We also run a push notification service and a few other small services. So that's kind of what Expo is. And in general, all these tools together sort of assemble to let you, come up with an idea, make something, and then get it to your users as easily as possible. And so then, how are we doing with this mission? Well, here's a graph from NPM stats of downloads of the Expo NPM package over the last 2 years. And it looks pretty good. You can see it starts at the left and goes up and to the right. That's the way that you want these graphs to look. We've got tens of thousands of developers every week using Expo to build stuff. We've got millions of people every week using the apps they make. We grow and grow and grow steadily. And we've got all kinds of different businesses using it. Flexport, which is a $3 billion company, built their first app using Expo. And they didn't have to eject. There were a nice blog post about it. Software Mansion and other consultancies build a lot of apps for clients using Expo because it's really quick to do that. We also have all kinds of things going on over the world. Like the Thai government uses it for reporting crimes to the police and SAT scores to students there. There's an app for getting celebrities to give you a shout out. There's fantasy sports apps. There's Bitcoin spinners. There's niche dating apps. There's a streetwear marketplace. The list goes on and on and on. So all kinds of apps from all kinds of businesses. We also have had a lot of success in education. We have classes being taught at Harvard and Stanford using Expo and teaching kids how to do this. We have partnerships with CodeHS and Replit and another one in the works with another organization that teach children mostly how to code. And we also have really good penetration at hackathons at colleges all over the world. I was at the Penn Apps, which is the biggest hackathon in the United States recently, and 7 out of the top 10 finishers on the pedestal had actually built some kind of mobile interface into the product that they'd hacked together in 48 hours using Expo. So that was really cool to see. And then one thing that was really awesome to see is recently this company DraftBit, one of the co-founders, Peter Pekarczyk, is here. They make a way for designers to build an app that is an Expo app without even coding. And so it's really cool to see that there are now companies that are built around Expo that have now come into existence. And then, last but not least, there's this App.js conference. And I think it's a certain kind of amazing milestone when somebody else says, hey, I want to host a conference that's about the thing that you work on. That feels really cool and feels like you've sort of made it. So that's all really great. But what we're trying to get towards is, I think, ubiquity. And let me talk about that, what means a little bit. And I think from a qualitative perspective, what that really means is kind of everyone around you is doing that, and it's the thing. Right now, I think TypeScript kind of feels like this thing that's becoming a thing that everybody uses all over the place, and you hear about it all the time. And a little bit further is maybe React, where you hear about anybody who's making a website is pretty much using React. And then even further down the pipe is maybe the web itself, where if you make a piece of application software now and you want to deliver it to desktop users, you pretty much are using the web. That's almost the only way to do it, 90% plus. And then beyond that, there's sort of things like air that we forget about because they're so common we don't even talk about them. But in sort of a more quantitative way, I think that we can sort of say maybe what achieving ubiquity means is that if one day sort of half of all applications that are made with Expo, then we've kind of really made it and are the number one thing. And so how are we doing there? And this is sort of Expo versus React Native. And it's about Expo is used about approximately a quarter of React Native projects. And that's pretty good. React Native is pretty popular. People like it a lot. But if you look at this graph, it's not like it's getting there. We're not on track to be even half of React Native, and React Native isn't maybe on track to be half of applications, period. So, something has to change to get us towards this ubiquity. And, can we even do it? And I think if we look around, look at history, look at other things going on, I think the answer is yes. One example is TypeScript, which I mentioned. I think if you've been paying attention in the JavaScript world, TypeScript is everywhere these days. All kinds of people are switching to it, building tooling around it, talking about it, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. But it actually is a project that's started in 2009 or 2010 and has gone through tons and tons of revisions. You can watch talks from Anders Heilsberg where he describes this whole process where they iterated and iterated and iterated and kept working on it and made it better and better and better for people, and finally have gotten to this point where it's sort of reached this escape velocity. And here is sort of a percentage of monthly active users on GitHub, when you can just sort of see somewhere around the end of 2014, they really started to do with a lot of things. They sort of hit their stride and got a lot of things right, and it just started marching up and up and up, and it's becoming one of the most popular languages on there. And so to distill the lessons from TypeScript down, kind of the secret sauce that they use is basically you fix and improve things that aren't working well, and then you listen to observe and engage with users in the community. That way you make sure that you're moving in the right direction. And then you need to add new things that make your stuff more powerful. I think if you do all these things, it's like pretty simple and it works. An example closer to home is React Navigation. You know, a little over a year ago, React Navigation was like this JS library for doing navigation. It was the recommended library if you read the React Native docs. But it was only used in something like 30 to 40% of projects despite that. And the people who used it were sometimes unhappy with it, and there were often debates on Reddit and Twitter and in forums and stuff, and I'm sure at water coolers and conferences, you know, should you use React Navigation? Should you use Wix's navigation solution? Should you use React native navigation? Should you write your own thing? And there were a whole bunch of things in the mix that people, you know, had pros and cons for. And basically what happened with that is that Brent Vatney, who works at Expo, and Eric Vicenti, who we sponsored to work on this, basically just dug in and just decided to fix this. And they basically ran that playbook. They went through and they fixed basically everything that people were complaining about. They made the API more elegant. They added stuff using screens and gesture handlers, great project from Software Mansion, that made it perform much better and feel almost indistinguishable from true native navigation. And all of the complaints basically went away. And now in like something like 65 to 70% of React Native projects, React Navigation is used. And if you read Reddit or you read Twitter and these kind of things, people just say, just use React Navigation. Like that's the right solution. It's good. And so what's amazing is the speed at which that turned around. And it's really fascinating to see that like, people are just in the development world so intense about how they choose their tools that like if you make something good, it's a really efficient market and people will switch to it really quickly. So let's talk about how we can run this playbook for Expo. We're already doing a lot of these things. We're working on improving things that aren't great. The number one thing that isn't great in Expo, and if you know anything about Expo, it's pretty obvious to you, is the ejecting flow. That's the thing everyone complains about. And so we thought about how to fix this, but we basically decided that the right way to fix this is not to fix it at all. We would just get rid of it, and we would, replace it. So the way we think about this is we have this idea called fast forwarding, where the idea is to like have people do things the way they normally would do them, and then when we try to make it easier, just make like a fast forward button that lets them skip steps or just get to where they're going faster, but don't build a parallel universe, don't build a parallel track, just make it work. And so the replacement for ejecting is what we call bare workflow, which basically means that you're just working with like a regular React Native project instead of in some weird world where you're an ejected Expo that like isn't as well documented as everything else and has quirks and isn't as good as everything else. And part of how we've done that is we built this thing called unimodules. Unimodules are modules that work everywhere. And what I mean by that is they work on iOS and Android, but we've also made them work in Flutter and opened up for bindings that can work in other platforms as well. We've also separated out each piece of the Expo SDK into an individual module so that you can take the Expo camera or the Expo notification service or the Expo gyroscope module and stick it into any React Native app and use it as a standalone thing. And so that, I think, is going to improve all kinds of stuff. One thing that will really improve is open source. Like one thing that has happened is that the React Native camera project actually copy-pasted a whole bunch of code from the Expo camera module because the Expo camera module has a great bunch of features and is really pretty well supported. But since people couldn't cherry-pick that out, they felt like they needed to copy it. So now we'll be able to unify those efforts into one project and put all that energy into making one thing great. We're also embracing TypeScript. We've written most of Expo into TypeScript, and we're going to eventually probably go the whole way there. But we're also supporting TypeScript now as sort of a first-class language that you can use to build applications. And then we've added self-hosting. When talking to people who are business users, a lot of them basically said, hey, we have business requirements where we can't use a third-party hosting service. We need to host the code ourselves. And we also just found that people wanted this for other reasons in sort of, they had testing infrastructure or other things like that. Or they were in Russia or China or somewhere where there was a firewall and our CDNs on Google and Amazon couldn't reach their users. So self-hosting allows people to do things themselves. Another thing we have going on is that we use this tool called Canny to collect feature requests and hear out problems and things like that from the community. And there was a disparate set of these that were sort of like Apple Pay integration, IAPs, making our build size smaller, et cetera. And we found the common thread was basically that like, when you were using the Expo client is this fat client that like we've built with our credentials for you and distributed through the App Store. But there's differences between that and doing sort of app development the normal way, where you might build something with Xcode, you might build it with Android Studio. And so for things like doing in-app purchases, for example, the way that in-app purchases work on iPhone or on Android is that they expect the credentials to be baked into the application binary, and that's the only way they can really work. So there's no elegant way to do that using the Expo client. And there's a number of other things like this. And so by working on ad hoc builds, we'll be able to deliver you a custom-built Expo client that you can install directly onto your phone that will let you do IAP development and all these other kinds of things. And in general, just will be closer to your production setup. And so all these kinds of problems will wash out. So switching gears to talking about making Expo more powerful and what we can add that makes Expo more popular. There was a company called Thistle that we had lunch with a little while back, and they basically told us, hey, here's our story. We only have 2 engineers, and we built a whole React website, and we do vegan meal delivery, so we can't really afford to hire a whole bunch of more engineers because most of our funding is going into operating that meal delivery service. And we weren't even going to have an app, but then one of us found Expo, and we built an Expo app over the weekend, and we were able to share some of our React code, and like that was great. And so now we're able to maintain an app and a website with just our 2 people. And so that was pretty interesting. And we also found like a lot of other people sort of saying, hey, we'd love to share code between a React web app and a React Native app. And there's some blog posts about doing this stuff. But it's usually pretty complicated to set up. We also were asking this question, like, what else are people using besides Expo? Are they using Flutter? Are they doing React native development without Expo? Are they building stuff in Swift and Kotlin or whatever? And there's a really clear answer. And it's basically that they're using the web. Like, look at this website for this conference. If there was ever a conference that you would think would have an app that has the schedule and these kind of things, you would think it would be this, like, App.js. But it's a website instead, and there's a whole bunch of reasons for that. It's really easy to build. It immediately works across both platforms. You can Google search for it. Sometimes you want to see it on a desktop, and like having a website is a great way to do that. So there's all these reasons why web is just really, really important for people. And so then if you start looking at the stats, here's the same graph that I just showed you, but I've added in React DOM. And all of a sudden, you barely can even see that these are trend lines below. Like, React DOM is actually growing on a percentage-wise basis much faster than React Native, which is sort of crazy considering that more people are getting phones than are getting computers, and people are using mobile and mobile even more. So web is really, really, really the elephant in the room here in terms of application development. So what we decided to do is make Expo work on the web. When you build an Expo app, starting with the new SDK release, SDK 33, that will come out soon, you'll get an iOS app, an Android app, and a web app, all instantly. All you have to do is like run the Expo CLI development tools and then hit W, and it'll pop up a URL, and you'll do it. You can then push that to AWS, Netlify, any other hosting service, do whatever you want with that website. And what's really cool about it is it'll work the same as your Expo app, in that we've taken React Native Web, this library built by Nicholas Gallagher, and then integrated into Expo. But then we've also, Evan Bacon, who worked on this, then took each library in the Expo SDK and made it work as well as it can on the web. There's actually a lot of things that you don't even maybe know work on the web if you know the APIs. And so here's an example of him making the camera view work. And so this is a web app that's just written as an Expo app and using the camera view. He's going to talk about that coming up next. And it's a really exciting, cool project. One thing that we hear a lot is that, what is the business model for Expo? How is this going to make money? And right now, we've self-funded the project, basically, and I think we'll continue to do that. That lets us keep our eyes on the North Star and lets us keep the direction. But I totally understand why people want to know that. Like, they want to know, are people going to keep working on this? And how can I predict what direction this company will go in, et cetera, et cetera? And so we want to build this. And so we don't have anything to announce now, but I can tell you how we're thinking about doing this soon. And it's basically that what we hear from users is that they want to pay us and that they want more features from our cloud services, more powerful ways to do over-the-air updates, builds, things like that. And so we'll probably build a bunch of software that you can run yourself. It'll be free and open source, because that's table stakes. I think there's no way we could get to be ubiquitous without being free and open source. But we'll run them you'll be able to run them yourselves. But if you want to run them in the cloud really easily, we'll have a paid hosted service for that. Looking way ahead, we're just going to keep following our North Star, fix and improve things that aren't working, listen to, observe, and engage with users in the community, and few things that make it more powerful and march towards ubiquity. Some things that we're not doing yet, but I think need to happen are there needs to be better debugging in React Native. There needs to be better performance. And here's another thing that we learned. We went to this hackathon a few weeks ago, and all these students were basically saying, hey, I'm making an app, and I found this great example on the web, and I copy-pasted it into my app, and it didn't work. And a lot of times we found that the reason was that example was maybe 6 or 7 months old, and React Native and Expo had moved a few versions into the future, and so the code isn't compatible. If you contrast that with the web is sort of infinitely backwards compatible, and so that's part of why the web is so popular, because you can find so many examples, so much documentation. So we do that. And then I talked about how Expo is now tri-platform, but looking deeper into the future, why not be everywhere? So this is an example of a Linux native desktop app that I cooked up yesterday based on Evan's work using Expo Web, where I just turned it into an Electron app. And this is me using the webcam just from this Electron app. And so for me in the future, I'm just going to go off and make Cheever, because the last SDK release, Expo SDK 32, actually included background location, which is the last missing piece of the puzzle for me to actually make this app that I described as the beginning of Expo. So thank you so much for coming and paying attention and being part of this community and contributing. And I'm so excited to see what you guys build.